you would be talking about a direct military conflict among nuclear armed powers. And so I think the shadow of nuclear weapons would hang over that conflict. And I think that China would have good incentives to manipulate and brandish nuclear weapons, just the way that Putin is in Ukraine, to try to influence the American response. And then there are scenarios where I could imagine nuclear weapons being used either by China or the United States or both.
Matthew Kroenig, thank you so much for speaking to us. It feels like nuclear weapons are more and more in the news at the moment. Do you feel we are in a new nuclear age? And how significant, I suppose, are nuclear weapons to what feels like a new age of confrontation and conflict at the moment?
Yes, I think we are in a new nuclear age, and nuclear weapons remain the ultimate instrument of military force. There's cyber and a lot of other technologies, but none of those technologies can destroy societies on the other side of the world in 30 minutes or less. Nuclear weapons are still the only capability that can do that. And for that reason, they were central to the great power competition of the First Cold War. And they only receded into the background, I think, because great power competition receded into the background after the end of the Cold War, when people were focusing on terrorism and counterinsurgency. Nuclear weapons were less relevant. But now that great power competition has returned, nuclear weapons are once again returning to the center of international politics.
What are the differences from the Cold War, that era of two powers, essentially, the US and its allies with smaller nuclear arsenals versus the Soviet Union? What are the differences now in terms of the threat that poses?
Yes, well, the Chinese had nuclear weapons starting in the 1960s, but the real difference now, I would argue, the most significant one is because of China's massive nuclear buildup, and China is probably engaged in the most far-reaching nuclear buildup since the 1960s, going from 200 or so nuclear weapons to 1,500 nuclear weapons. So we'll be a peer with the United States and Russia in the coming years. And so this means for the first time in history, the United States and its allies will have to deal with not just one nuclear superpower, but two peer nuclear superpowers at the same time. And so that really raises some fundamental questions about nuclear strategy, U.S. nuclear force posture and numbers, how much is enough. And then, of course, you have North Korea as a nuclear power, and Iran that is only a couple weeks away from having a nuclear weapons capability. So it is more dangerous in many ways than the first Cold War.
Let's touch on China. It feels like when we talk about Russia and the US's confrontation with Russia, the West's confrontation with Russia, nuclear weapons are never far away from that conversation. There's obvious reasons for that historically. With China, it feels like we talk more about Trump's economic policy towards China. Maybe we talk about the South China Sea. It strikes me that nuclear weapons are further away from that conversation with China. Are we wrong to... Do you think we overlook the threat of nuclear weapons in particularly now the US's confrontation with China? And what is the threat of Chinese nuclear weapons to, for example, the United States?
Yes. Well, to the question of do we overlook it, I think it depends on who the we is. I think you're right that it's not front page news in the way that Russia's nuclear threats are, but the expert community is paying close attention. And yes, this is very important. Again, China is engaged in the biggest nuclear buildup in more than half a century. So China clearly thinks their nuclear weapons are important. And why are they doing this? And there are several theories, but none of them are really good. And I think the one that's most plausible to me is that they do want to invade Taiwan if necessary, as Xi has said many times. And so they believe that there is a great likelihood that the United States would intervene on Taiwan's behalf. And so this would be a war among nuclear powers. And I think China wants the ability to nuke the United States a lot, not just a little, to try to deter U.S. intervention or limit U.S. intervention. And they're watching what's happening in Ukraine, and they see that Putin's nuclear threats are working. President Biden was very clear, and the West was very clear that we did calibrate our assistance to Ukraine because we were afraid of Russian nuclear escalation. And so China wants to be able to do the same thing, to be able to use military force in its region and to limit the West's response due to fears of nuclear escalation.
And just talk us through how that process works. For example, in the example you take of Taiwan, China starts to invade, starts to intervene. The US then bulks up its support and threatens to step in militarily. Just talk us through step by step how you think that confrontation might unfold between the US and China, because otherwise I think we get into very sort of Dr. Strangelove situations in our minds. Just talk through from an expert's perspective what that looks like.
Well, China would have two major options. The first would be a blockade to try to cut the island off from the outside world and force Taiwan's leaders to capitulate. But I don't think that's a strong option because Taiwan's leaders are unlikely to just agree to be absorbed into mainland China. They're pretty opposed to that. So then the second option would be a full scale invasion. And to do that, China would have to move over large numbers of soldiers to occupy Taiwan. And so the way they would likely do that would be on ships. And China is building large numbers of amphibious landing craft to do that. And so essentially the US, the Taiwan, the allied strategy to stop that would be, as a former US defense official put it, to sink the Chinese Navy in 72 hours. But essentially we need more anti-ship missiles, more torpedoes, et cetera, to destroy those ships before they could get to the island. But so you would be talking about a direct military conflict among nuclear armed powers. And so I think the shadow of nuclear weapons would hang over that conflict. And I think that China would have good incentives to manipulate and brandish nuclear weapons, just the way that Putin is in Ukraine, to try to influence the American response. And then there are scenarios where I could imagine nuclear weapons being used either by China or the United States or both.
Technologically, what is the difference from the Cold War, and what difference does advanced technology now make to how a nuclear crisis would escalate compared to how it would have, say, in Cuba in 1963?
Yes, well, there are a number of differences. One with more advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. We'd probably have a better sense of what the adversary was doing if it was moving mobile nuclear missiles, for example. But then also, amazing what we just saw on the battlefield in Ukraine a few days ago with Ukraine using drones to attack Russian strategic bombers. So we used to think that if you wanted to attack an adversary's nuclear forces, you would have to launch your own intercontinental range nuclear attack. And so the attack just a few days ago does raise interesting questions for nuclear strategy. Could the United States or China or Russia attempt to disarm their opponents of strategic forces using these new technologies, drones, for example?
Let's just touch on that attack briefly. Obviously, Ukraine targeted Russia's strategic bombers. How significant is that as an impairment to, say, Russia's nuclear arsenal in this instance? But talking more generally, say bombers, are they particularly important to a nuclear arsenal now, or are we more focused on submarines, on intercontinental ballistic missiles?
Yes. Well, the United States has had a nuclear triad for decades. So this is triad is strategic bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-based missiles. And many officials have looked at this over the years and thought, can we cut a leg or two? And time again, every Secretary of Defense, Democratic and Republican administrations, comes to the conclusion that no, all three are necessary and each has its own special attributes. And so I think the short answer is that strategic bombers are important. Other legs are important as well, but Russia wouldn't have gone to the trouble of building and maintaining these bombers if they thought they didn't need them.
And this week in the United Kingdom, we've had our strategic defence review. They've looked at increasing our nuclear arsenal, or certainly updating it. France has also spoken about updating its nuclear arsenal. But frankly, these countries have tiny nuclear arsenals compared to the United States and Russia. Any scenario I've read about how a nuclear war might unfold tends to escalate pretty quickly and go way beyond what the UK and France would be able to bring to the table, do they ultimately matter? Or is this really just, as you say, a three-horse race between the US, Russia, and China? And if, in the ungodly event that nuclear weapons were used, do the likes of the UK, France, even North Korea and Iran sort of fade into the background?
Yes. Well, I think British and French nuclear weapons do matter, but they also don't substitute for what U.S. nuclear weapons do. So I think British and French nuclear weapons are helpful for deterring attacks against Britain and France. I think Russia would have to think differently about attacking the UK or attacking France than it would say about attacking, I don't know, Germany or a non-nuclear country. Second, it does calculate Russian and to some degree Chinese calculations if they're thinking about a possible conflict with NATO. They can't just focus on America's nuclear weapons. They do realize that there are two other actors with their finger on the nuclear trigger. But I don't think that Britain and France can do what the US can do, which is to extend nuclear deterrence over the entire free world. More than 30 formal treaty allies, almost 60% of global GDP, all of NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, protected by America's nuclear umbrella. And I think to do that, you do need this larger, more robust force that the United States brings to the table that Britain and France just do not.
And just finally, I know you've got to go. We're in a world, as you've described, where more countries have their finger on the nuclear trigger. We're also in a world where technology means that trigger is faster. I mean, a nuclear payload could be delivered, as you say, in 30 minutes rather than hours or whatever. What are the sort of measures that countries need to be taking now? What are the sort of global infrastructure we need to be putting in place to avert a nuclear crisis and avoid more proliferation?
Well, I think the biggest risks right now come from a weak West. I think that Putin invaded Ukraine because he thought he could get away with it. He's making nuclear threats because he thinks that they work. Xi is building up his nuclear arsenal because he thinks he can use that to coerce the West. So I think the most important thing we can do right now is to strengthen our own deterrence. And so that starts at the conventional level. And so it's good to see European allies building up their conventional defenses. But then also at the strategic level. And I was appointed by Congress to serve on a commission to review U.S. Strategic forces policy. The report was released at the end of 2023. It didn't get a lot of attention because it came a few days after Hamas's attacks against Israel. But essentially, our commission called for the first nuclear weapons buildup in the United States since the end of the Cold War. We called for the Pentagon to buy more nuclear-capable bombers, more nuclear-capable submarines, to upload more warheads on our existing missiles, and to develop and deploy more theater non-strategic nuclear weapons to both Europe and Asia. So I think that's the most important thing we can do, both to deter the adversaries, but also to assure allies. If the U.S. nuclear posture is weak, more likely that, say, a South Korea or a Poland say, maybe we should build our own nuclear weapons. But if they see that American nuclear umbrella is still strong, more likely that we convince them not to build their own nuclear weapons and to rely on U.S. extended deterrence.
In this case, more is more. Matthew Kroenig, thank you very much for joining us.